Welcome you all to today's webinar, International Reaction to COVID, an Overview. I'm Judith Cano, responsible for the Global Engagement Office and part of the Deusto Summer School team. First, on behalf of University of Deusto, we wanted to thank you for your interest in today's webinar. Please feel free to send your questions through the chat box, and our guests will answer them at the end of the webinar. I'm delighted to introduce our webinar's chairperson, Juan Moscoso, PhD in Economics and Business at Universidad Autónoma de Madrid, Director of Deusto Global Affairs at Deusto Business School in Madrid. He holds long experience working in economic matters for the European Commission and the Spanish government. Now I give the floor to Juan to introduce our guest lecturer. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you very much, Judith. Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning if you're watching us from the other side of the Atlantic. I want you to introduce you to our guest today, our guest in our Deusto Summer School webinar, which is, as you know, a presentation of our summer school course, International Relations in the Post-COVID Context, the role of business diplomacy, that will be held in Deusto Summer School between July 13th and 16th. And you can still describe it and follow it in the coming days. Matt Browne is a senior fellow from the Center for American Progress. He's British. He has studied also in the College of Europe, a master's degree in Bruges, Belgium. And before that, before being a senior fellow Center for American Progress, he worked for Tony Blair in Downing Street in his cabinet, and as well, he was the director of Policy Network, which is the main progressive think tank from the Labour Party and in the UK. He is also the founder of Global Progress, which is the main network of thinkers, politicians, and scientists who deal with matters all abroad in the world linked with policy and social and economic answers to our main economic and political problems. Good afternoon, Matt. Thank you very much for being here today with us at Deusto University. And we would like to talk with you today is to do an overall review of how you think the international reaction to the COVID pandemic has been. Our first question will be, what are your main conclusions or your main ideas regarding the very different acceptance that different public opinions have had regarding what some governments have done and others? For example, how do you see the different acceptance of the Angela Merkel's ruling of its country, the UK, Spain, the US? I mean, like it is like a first matter to get into the issue. Thank you.
Great. Well, listen, Juan, thank you very much for the invitation to join you this evening. It's a shame that I can't be with you in Madrid, but hopefully at some point very soon we will be together. Thank you, Judith, also for coordinating this, and everyone else at Deusto Summer School for the work that you're doing. This is a very important topic and a very timely discussion on these themes. I think there's a couple of things that I'd like to say at the very start, Juan, and then we can dig into that. I think the first thing that I would like to say is that before we get into the actual numbers, what I'd like to say is that at the top line, when you think about the debate about responses to COVID-19, what emerged very early on, and which was pushed also by the Chinese Communist Party and others, was this view that somehow authoritarian or illiberal regimes were responding much better to the COVID crisis than democracies per se. So I think that's one axis that emerged. I think it's completely false, by the way. We actually don't know how well authoritarian regimes have responded to this crisis because we can't trust the data that comes out of those regimes. But we do know for a fact that the Chinese government did its very best to hide the impact of COVID and the consequences of it that allowed for the spread. So I'm very skeptical first about that general view that authoritarian or illiberal states do better than democratic states. And then when we look at the views of public opinion within democratic states, I think what is noticeable, with the exception of the United States and with the exception of France, in the early days of COVID-19 pandemic, there was an enormous, what we would call, rallying around the flag effect. That is to say that the public wanted to know what was happening. They wanted to know how the government felt the country should respond. And the measures that were taken were generally broadly supported. And support for the government, the incumbent parties, generally chose to rise. Or was seen to rise. That wasn't the case in France. It wasn't the case in the United States. But generally speaking, that was what we saw. And then over time, what began to happen was that different countries, different publics. This is in some way the first simultaneous global crisis that everyone was experiencing. There was a time lag between when certain countries saw the spike in the virus. But we were all living through the same shared experience. And so it was kind of a real-time comparative public policy experiment. And what became clear was that some governments were doing much better than others. I mean, the governments that are seen to have done the best, I think, are actually democracies. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, through quick, decisive action, has practically eradicated the virus. At last count, there were 22 people in the country that had the virus. Those were people who were returning, New Zealanders from abroad returning, and are in quarantine. Other countries, such as the UK, have done far worse. Yet, to a large degree, up until recently, public opinion remained supportive until, and I think this is the interesting thing about the UK, until it was seen that everyone wasn't in together. When Dominic Cummings, a senior advisor to the Prime Minister, was seen to break the rules, support for the government fell apart. So that this notion that we were all in together held everything. And even in Sweden, where you look at the per capita death rate and it's much higher than in other countries, if you actually look at support for the government, the Swedish people tend to be very, very supportive of they support the measures and the approach that the government take. It was out of sync with the approach that every other government in Europe seems to have taken, but they have support for it. So I think in these moments of crisis, what you've seen is so long as people are being fair and being just, then generally there is a rallying around the flag effect in support of government measures, because these are unprecedented times.
What do you think about the reaction in Germany, and at the same time the very active and dynamic role that Angela Merkel has played, trying to get together a European answer to the economic part of the crisis? I mean, because Germany has been also a special case for the huge support that they have been able to gather.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, in terms of Germany and Angela Merkel on the COVID crisis, I think what people want to see in a time of crisis is decisive leadership. They want to see people acting with conviction. They want to see people bringing as many people into the, for want of a term, the decision-making tent as possible. That experts, doctors, nurses, scientists who are studying the spread of the virus, that they're all brought in and consulted, and that expert knowledge is being taken into account. I don't believe this sort of like right-wing populist view that people have had enough of experts. When they're in a plane, they want a pilot who's qualified to fly the plane. And when a pandemic hits, they want somebody who understands infectious diseases to tell them how to respond to it. So I think what Angela Merkel did was give very clear leadership, set out very clear guidelines about how the country would respond, in what ways. So that clarity was important both for citizens and for business. They knew what to expect. but they also trusted that she was bringing in the best brains that Germany had to address how best to respond to this crisis, listening to them and assessing it. So I think that's one element. In terms of the Merkel's role in the European level in terms of the economic response, I mean, I have a mixed view about this. I mean, like, I think Angela Merkel moves when she has to move. She's not exactly a visionary, proactive Keynesian European. I think that Olaf Scholz, the vice chancellor and finance minister, played a much larger role in brokering that, in brokering that deal. Certainly at the European level, certainly in terms of helping coordinate with other leaders such as Costa, Pedro Sanchez, and others to put pressure on her to move. So I'm not convinced that that Merkel was the leading figure in driving a different European response. But to her credit, she has accepted the need for that. She has understood the politics of this, both domestically and at the European level, and managed to negotiate that. And that, again, is a sign of leadership.
Also, in Germany, there's been a very large and wide support from the opposition to the measures put forward by the government. It has been the case also, for example, in Italy, where the crisis started with very, very bad numbers and also in a very critical previous political situation. But we've seen Italians getting closer and with more political cohesion after this. It hasn't been the case in Spain or of the US. We can talk a bit about this before jumping over the Atlantic to the US. How do you see this use by populists? You were saying of moving the flag, I mean, how using this crisis in order to exacerbate polarization?
Look, I think
all these matters.
Yeah, look, my view is that even in the UK, which is quite polarized, we saw support for the government measures, and for quite a long period of time. I think when a government is acting to deal with an unprecedented crisis that wasn't foreseen, I mean, that maybe, you know, like, people have foreseen the idea of pandemics and we've gamed them out. There have been theoretical games about how we respond, but living that in real life and trying to catch up with the science and trying to is very different to playing this out in a game. So when a government is acting, I find it, to be quite honest, reprehensible that opposition parties, populists or others, would try and make political speed of this. So people who question the need for lockdowns, people who question whether coronavirus is real or not. You know, one of the things that we experienced in the UK, and I don't know whether it happened in Spain or elsewhere, was this conspiracy theory around 5G masts. The idea that somehow wireless masts, the 5G network, was actually spreading the symptoms of the virus. So here we all are in lockdown. We're dependent upon wireless and Wi-Fi networks to keep us connected to the people we love and to the work that we're doing. And if we have children, to the schools that hopefully are providing them with some online classes. And at the same time, there's a bunch of right-wing fanatics, populist conspiracy theorists out there spreading the idea that these masts that are keeping us all connected are actually the cause of the disease. And in the UK and elsewhere, I don't know about Spain, these things were torn down. So, you know, like, I'm not an expert on the politics of Spain, Juan. You know that much more than I do. But my general view is that people on the extremes who try and manipulate a moment of crisis for political gain should take a long, hard look at themselves in the mirror and think about how they could do things differently.
Yeah. Okay. You've lived many years.
Is that okay?
Yes, that's very good. Your Wi-Fi sometimes is a bit unstable, but we are listening to you very well. And what about the US? Because the US had more time to prevent the crisis. It hit there later. That's what we see at the beginning. And what we're watching now is that there is I mean, the situation is politically, in health terms, economically, in polarization, and also very, very worsened by the case of this person who was killed by the police in Milwaukee. How do you see? Tell us a little bit. How do you see how the crisis is changing U.S. politics and the road to the next November's election?
Look, I mean, I think the US is a very particular case, different to everyone else. So first of all, I would say politics never really ended in America. In most countries, the crisis hit. It was a moment when the nation should come together. That happened for a very, very short period of time in the United States when Congress passed a sort of stimulus support package in the early days. But very quickly, the politics returned. And the reason why I think that happened is that almost everything in the United States now is viewed through the prism of a culture war. And that drove the way in which certainly the incumbent president responded to this. You know, his initial reaction was to praise China for doing a good job. His next reaction was to blame them for not stopping the spread of the disease earlier. He tries to, you know, the idea, he does not do very well at a politics of unity, of like bringing everyone together. His politics is a politics of division. It requires picking an enemy and turning everyone against that enemy, divide and rule. And so he's picked various enemies throughout this crisis. And then in the midst of this, we had the senseless murder of George Floyd, as you say, which stimulated the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think, you know, is a crisis within a crisis. And the reason why that crisis within the crisis is so profound is that we also know, it's the same in the UK, that people of color are also more likely to die of COVID for a host of reasons. But that is more likely. And so the injustice of racial inequality and of police brutality has been raised. And yet again, as that happens, the response of the President of the United States was to up the ante, to call for division, to use tear gas in Washington, D.C. to disperse people so that he could make some kind of symbolic appearance in front of a church. And so I think when you look at the numbers now, you know, it's very interesting, but the position of Biden in terms of the election is very clear. He has a very large lead, larger than Hillary Clinton's this time last year. Yeah. He has a larger share of the vote. So he's well above the 50% threshold, which she wasn't. And so I think in that regard, it bodes well, because effectively what we're seeing is people getting tired of being divided. I think Americans are tired of being divided. I think they find it exhausting. And they're also tired of incompetence, of someone who just doesn't seem to care about them and just cares about power and his own position. So I think that in some ways the COVID-19 pandemic and the George Floyd protests remind me a little bit of Hurricane Katrina, which was 2 or 3 years, I think, before Obama defeated Bush. But it was just this sense that, like, all of the frailties of that government had been exposed. All of the frailties of his and contradictions of his presidency were exposed. And from that, you know, in 2006, there was a massive swing in the House towards Democrats, and then Obama took the White House. And I sort of feel like that the momentum feels a bit like this, that like this administration has been exposed for its hypocrisy, its incompetence, and also for its inability to pull the country together at a time when it really needed to be pulled together.
And do you think that I mean, I agree with you completely that it's the US in the cultural world, and we've been discussing during years the identity politics, polarization politics, the fake news politics, the division politics, the different constituencies, different media politics, completely isolated, and that is coming to an end. Maybe. Do you think the COVID and the pandemic could accelerate the end of this period of polarized politics, also in other places where people really want to get together closely to real politics, invest in health, in policies that people see that produce results in a different way. So, I mean, could this be like a global momentum thing?
So, look, I mean, I think we have to look partly, in responding to that, we have to look partly at what is happening with information infrastructure. So one of the reasons why we're so divided is that as we increasingly get our information from Facebook, Twitter, and other social media sources, there is an algorithm that feeds us more and more extreme views of the things that we like. So if you're really nerdy and centrist, you'll get more and more nerdy centrist views. If you're racist and xenophobic, you'll get more and more racist and xenophobic views. If you like cuddly kittens that like to dance on pianos, you'll get more cuddly kittens that like to dance on pianos. And if you're extreme left wing, you'll get more of that. So there is a business model in the information infrastructure that polarizes, that fragments, and that's really important. I think one of the things that's happened during this crisis, which is a problem, the fragmentation and the sort of like extremization of the different fragments of the social media business model, it makes it much easier to target people with disinformation, misinformation, or propaganda that they are likely to be susceptible to. Now, one of the problems for the social media companies is that they've tried to be proactive around the COVID crisis. They failed, but they've tried to do their best. I think that has exposed to governments and to citizens the scale of the influence of these groups. The Tony Blair Institute for Global Change released a study today about how people feel and what the impact of social media platforms are on society. It's a comparative study, and I advise everyone to go and have a look at it. And what it says is that, like, when it comes to Twitter, when it comes to Facebook, people no longer believe that these platforms are forces for good, right? That they're not actually improving the world. In fact, they're making the world a less better place. So I think COVID has exposed that, because misinformation about a virus outside of the United States is largely uncontested as something that should be pulled down. Now, the platforms have tried to do that, and so they've shown that some of the things they said they couldn't do about misinformation politically, they can actually do. So that we know that some of the actions they've said they couldn't take, they can actually take now. They are actually technically possible. So that's one element. But the other thing is, it's clear that their business model is flawed. And it's not done enough. And so I think there's going to be a growing appetite for regulation around online harms. And my own personal view is that that is a necessary first step before building a broader consensus towards policies that can take our various countries forward. In other words, we've got to tackle the misinformation crisis first before we can do anything else, because otherwise misinformation will just divide society. Like, if we don't do that, I suspect that the next crisis of misinformation we're going to face is the anti-vaxxer movement, which I don't know, which traditionally the far right support from a kind of libertarian standpoint. But we are going to get into a situation, hopefully there will be a number of different vaccine options to COVID-19 that will emerge in the next 12 months. I would suspect that people who produce those vaccines will be aggressively running media campaigns to say that their vaccine is better than another vaccine. And I suspect people who are anti-vaxxers will aggressively be running against all of the vaccines. And so without some kind of sensible public debate where we can work through these issues, I think society will be torn apart again. So I'm not sort of hopeful that COVID itself has created a moment where we can all move forward, because I think politics will return very quickly. But I think it has exposed some of the avenues through which we can make sure that the sort of broader infrastructure which pulls us apart can be transformed, and we can come back together again in a better way.
Okay. Before we go to the public questions that we have already, some already, I want to ask you also another thing linked with the UK or English or British. Do you think that the pandemic may have an effect on Brexit and the path that Brexit was taking? I mean, not only the negotiations, but with the EU, between the British government and the Commission, but also the way you British may feel about the whole thing now after this shock that has been the pandemic.
So I think, I mean, we passed the deadline now for asking for an extension, which, you know, like as soon, if I were in charge, and I suspect most other governments in the history of the UK would have asked for an extension, but we have the Brexit boys running the country, Johnson, Gove, and Cummings and the like. They were the people who ran the campaign, decided Brexit was a good thing, so they were never going to ask for an extension. But I think any other government would have asked for an extension, because we're in unprecedented times, and the idea that we can manage this crisis, the economic fallout, and negotiate a good deal that's beneficial for both sides in terms of leaving the EU, a trade agreement that follows, I think is nonsensical. So that moment has passed, unfortunately, and so that won't be impacted. I think the likely impact of this is that the government knows that there is quite a detrimental economic effect and impact of Brexit, and they will bury that under the economic consequences of the COVID pandemic. So I think that's the impact of it. The impact of it is that it gives the government an excuse to cover up the real impact of Brexit, because we've had the pandemic at the same time. I don't think it will change opinions at all. And I also feel that the European Union and most of the member states have moved into a position where they've factored in Brexit. They're much less worried about it. They're much less worried about the idea of a no-deal Brexit, even. They know that there's a significant shock, and so like Brexit, the shock of I mean, the EU has also done trade deals with a whole set of other countries that actually offset much of the impact of trade with the UK if that is interrupted. So I think the EU is not worried about it. So my view is that we're headed right now. We're full steam ahead for a no-deal Brexit, which will have minimal impact on the Europeans, the members of the EU, and a massive impact on the Brits. But that will be covered over by the fact that it's very hard to distinguish between what is the impact of COVID and what is the impact of exiting the European Union.
Okay, we have some questions now from the public that are watching us. I didn't tell you at the beginning, but Matt Browne is also a member of our advisory board in Deusto Global Affairs and Strategic Issues. He's one of our honorable members. A couple of questions regarding how will the pandemic, the COVID-19, affect some of the largest tendencies or movements regarding geopolitics. One is regarding the US and China rivalry, no? How this might affect the trade war and other wars that already started before it. And also we have some questions regarding the role, for example, that China is beginning to play after the pandemic in Asia, And this question underlines the recent frontiers events between China and India, for example. So how do you think this Asian emergency process after the pandemic?
So, I mean, first off, on the China-India example, I'm really not well placed to talk about that. So I'll concentrate on the first question rather than the second, which is geopolitics and US-China. Firstly, internally within China and its relationships with Hong Kong, I think what you've seen is the Chinese have used the world's distraction with this crisis to push ahead with some very draconian measures. The idea that Hong Kong and China will be like one country, two systems is gone. And the world has seen just how repressive China can be when it wishes to be. And I think that, as a Brit, I think that's a particularly difficult thing to see 23 years on from the transition. I think what is also clear is that you're witnessing the emergence of and I don't use this term lightly, but a kind of new Cold War between the US and China. Trump has gone very aggressively on China, even though if John Bolton's book is to be believed, he's been asking them for favors to help with his re-election. But publicly speaking, the position of the Republicans is very hawkish towards China. I saw reports about them stopping a child labor ship today. I don't know whether those are verified or not, but they're going very aggressively. And Biden will go as aggressively because he's not going to be out-hawked on this issue. So I think in terms of relationships between the US and China, that is a situation that will become increasingly aggravated over time. I think that poses questions for the European Union. My own view is that the EU is also in a period where relationships with China will get colder and harsher. When you look at the European Union idea about a Green New Deal and the idea of having a tax on carbon coming in to the European economy, this is something that the Chinese aggressively campaign against. But I think it is something that could unite a Biden administration in the US and the European Union who want to do things about the Green New Deal. So I think we're entering into a very tense phase of geopolitics. One that is compounded by the fact that Vladimir Putin is now likely to be in charge of Russia until 2036, following the results of the referendum in Russia recently about whether he could stand again, and the transformation of the constitution. So, there's a lot at stake in November, but my hope is that Biden comes out of the election in November victorious, and that the US and the EU can be a bastion for sort of liberal democracy, not liberalist democracy, but liberal democracy, and that we can defend the rule of law, and that we can be bulwarks against what seems to be a very authoritarian turn in other parts of the world.
You said at the beginning that when people analyze or when we first analyze the effects of the pandemic, there was this first differentiation between liberal and authoritarian response to the crisis. And we remember that how this debate of who did better or worse and why. But also now we're talking about China. There is a different approach from the US and the European Union towards China, and there's also a very different approach within European progressives and the European left. There is a part of the left which is very worried by a process of political hegemony of the Chinese world without freedoms and liberties. But at the same time, there is another part of the left that sees with good eyes, for example, the amount of wealth and big figures of people who have left poverty in China despite the lack of freedom. No? Do you think this debate could be also growing in Europe in the future? Because I tell you, it is happening in Spain. No? Mm.
So look, I think that is how would I describe it? I think that the second half of the 20th century was a battle between communism or state socialism and market capitalism of some form. The dividing line in politics in the 21st century is going to be between forms of capitalism, between authoritarian capitalism and democratic capitalism. And it is true, undoubtedly true, that China has done very well since it's entered the World Trade Organization and become part of the international system in lifting a large number of people out of poverty. What remains to be seen is how sustainable that is in a country where individual freedoms are not protected and are not respected. And we don't know the answer to that yet. But do I believe that the battle between authoritarian capitalism and democratic capitalism will be a dividing line, an increasing dividing line in 21st century politics in our own country? Yes, absolutely. And I think one of the things that we're very naive about is the extent to which these authoritarian states are engaged in that battle in our own countries, whether through Russia Today and Sputnik on the part of the Russians, whether through a very, since the Hong Kong protests, what we have seen is a very aggressive stepping up of the role of the Chinese state and the Chinese Communist Party in using social media to present particular views about China's role in the world and who China are and what they're doing on climate change and all of these issues. One that, if you didn't know the details of the actual politics, would be very persuasive. So I think this is absolutely going to be a new front line of politics in the 21st century that is being fought inside our own countries, on our own TV and online. And we need to step up our game. I think it's sort of, in some ways, I think those of us who believe in liberal democratic capitalism and as progressives, one that's moderated and transformed to lift all people rather than create polarities of wealth. I think we've been slightly naive. We sort of bought in the 1990s into Fukuyama's view that history had come to an end, and it hasn't. Actually, history has reinserted itself. Divisions have reinserted themselves right back into geopolitics. And yet we aren't tooled up for that fight. We do very little, for example, to expose the brutalities of the Chinese and the Russian regimes, or the Indian ones. And in some ways, we're very nervous about it because we worry about them now as large economies. In other words, success of integrating China and Russia into the global trading regime has made it harder for us to push back against the things that we don't like and we think are unfair, precisely because we're worried about their markets. So I think that how those tensions play out over the next decade or so will define the future of the 21st century.
All right. Well, thanks, Matt. We are right out of time. We have one last question, and then you can answer, and then Judith and Lorena will close the event. We have a question from Ichazo. It says, asking if you think that the pandemic has changed the sense or idea of solidarity among EU members regarding all these geopolitical effects. And also, I would like you to be very brief, saying what will be your main, what do you think the main consequences that all this has produced for policymakers and for the kind of analysis and work you do, and you've been very intense for all these weeks. Thanks, Matt.
Okay, so on the issue of solidarity, I think what the pandemic, I don't think there's been a great deal of solidarity on the economic front in the European Union for the last decade, since the global financial crisis. I think that there has been a very almost Calvinistic approach from the north towards the south, to the detriment of the European Union and to everybody living with the European project, and everyone living within the European Union. I think what the pandemic has done is exposed the frailties of that, because what we've all seen is that we're all linked together. I've had conversations with Danes, with Germans, even with Swedes, who seem to be at the vanguard of the so-called frugal states, and they all understand that the recovery of the Southern European economy is actually central to their recovery. So I think that we're reaching a moment. I wouldn't say it's a Hamiltonian moment where we have fiscal integration of the EU and so on, but we're reaching a moment where there is a tipping point, and the question becomes, how do we build on that? In terms of like, what's my takeaway on the policymakers from the work that I do? I think that what we've seen is that when you rehabilitate experts, or at least the crisis has provided an opportunity for the rehabilitation of experts. This notion that actually understanding what is going on, how to manage and respond to the problem, it's a brief window, but I think that view that actually it's not so bad to have studied, not so bad to know what you're talking about. It's not all about gut instinct. It's not all about feeling. The combination of that revival of solidarity, which we've seen not just at the European level, by the way, but in communities where people have been helping out their neighbors and trusting one another and working together to share shopping, to take care of people who are on their own, whatever it may be. There's been a revival of voluntarism and community spirit. That combined with a kind of need to say, like, look, we want the best brains, the people who understand this problem, to be working on it. We're not going to give them free rein, but we need to integrate them into the process. That, I think, fills me with hope for how we build beyond this situation. So I'm optimistic. I mean, we're living in very dark times. It's been a very difficult few months for everyone, but I'm actually optimistic about where we go from here.
Well, thanks, Matt. We're very proud having you as a board member in our advisory board in Deusto Global World Affairs and Strategic Issues. And we really hope, and we're looking forward to have you next year in Deusto Summer School, present in San Sebastian or Bilbao. We know how much you enjoy and you like our country. I think it's been a very good discussion. And I will end saying that I remind everybody that we are also presenting our summer course, which will take place between July 13 and 16 in Deusto Summer School, which is about international relations in the post-COVID context, the role of business diplomacy. And today we had this talk with our fellow Matt Browne in order to prepare the debate for those very interesting days that will take place in 2 weeks. That's it. No? Thank you.
Thank you, Juan. Juan. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Want to say something?
I say, Juan, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be part of the board and to work with all of you at Deusto. I hope the summer school goes very well, and I certainly hope that we can do it in person in San Sebastian next year. So thank you.